In this video, we're going to take a closer look at the overall architecture of IIB, and specifically, we want to see how the various components sort of interoperate. Now, we did that already with SPSS. What we want to do now is essentially understand the really large part of the system. And what I mean by that is, if this is our integration bus, then we have something very, very important in the middle here called the integration node. And in fact, we already looked at the integration node, but this is not the same kind of node that we have been looking at in the past. In other words, we had said, well, all right, if you have some kind of a node, remember, is a step along the processing route of some sort of message, right? So this is a node, and this is kind of the input, and this is the output. We saw that whole thing as a message flow, and that is true. And we've also shortcutted that by saying it was our application, which we're going to see is 99% right, but well, 95% right, but it's not quite right. Okay, so those are nodes. This is a different sort of node. It's not a node that does integration, although if you want, you can think of it that way. It is the integration node, and really it's like an overarching node. You can think of it as the piece that goes around all of this. And indeed, that's exactly what's happening. That is the integration node. Now, in previous versions of WebSphere, well, of IIB, which were called WebSphere MQ, that was what is today known as IIB. They use different terminology, and in fact, there is a manual, written in 2005, that is the best sort of outside in, so that's from 30,000 feet down to the details, that outside in approach of understanding WebSphere MQ. Sorry, this should say WebSphere MQ Broker, of course. WebSphere MQ Broker. This PDF is actually still really excellent. It is the outside in view, like I was talking about, as opposed to the Knowledge Center, because the Knowledge Center does the inside out view. So in other words, it's taking you from there, it's taking you in a close-up level. It's really lots of details about particular things, and it doesn't give you the overarching view of how the system works. So this particular PDF we're going to be looking at later on, but you have to keep in mind, this was written so long ago, 2005, that many of the terms have changed. One of those, I mean, even in the name of the product, I mean, it was called the Broker, and now it's, of course, called IIB. So it's still the best book for the time being, so I'm going to explain some of the terms that are used here in this system here, and I'm going to translate them here. So, for example, the integration node was formerly called the Broker. That's its previous name. And actually, in the current documentation, you'll see that it's still called the Broker. In the current KC, you will see it's still called the Broker in many places. And really what it does is it is a set of execution processes that host and run message flows. So in other words, if it's hosting and running message flows, then that should sound very familiar to what we looked at just previously in the last video. And that is, indeed, this should ring a bell, it is our runtime. In other words, it is everything, it is all the behaviors for essentially IIB. All the behavior that you did not write, all the stuff that is running that you did not, in fact, create. It is the core of the system. That's the integration node. And it is responsible for a huge amount of actual processing, because essentially it is the software for the system, right? What do I mean by that? Okay, well, inside the integration node, you're going to see something called the integration server. Now, an integration server is not a physical server, it's a software server, and its job is to run applications. So what does that mean? Well, again, we had seen before that when you have a node along this processing step, a processing step along the path of creating these applications, that and then we had actually even seen this is typically drawn like this, where it goes in like so. This whole thing is a message flow, and what we haven't really talked about is the fact that this is, and we called this an application, but technically speaking, that's not actually the application. The application could also come with something outside of that flow, which are static libraries. And when you put all of that together, then you have an application. But very interestingly, that is also just part of the picture, because an integration server, its job is to serve out these applications. So although I just drew one, you can see that in fact you very often will have multiple applications, and that's the reason it's called a server. It is serving out these applications. Now, the integration server was formerly called an execution group, and in some ways that's actually a kind of nicer way to understand what it was doing, because it is after you have created, that's the previous term, right? Previously. Once you have created your applications down here, then the server's job was to go out and execute them. And what does that mean? Execute them? Well, it means that you would deploy. So this is the terminology that's used after you have your application and you want it to sort of go live. You deploy it into the runtime. That is the idea behind IIB. So you can see that's why it was called the execution group previously. Now, another interesting thing behind the server is that the actual server is an OS process. So you will see it running as such. It is a process that will run on the server. And each server is serving out applications. And again, we had said that if this is your MQ system, and this is IIB, we'd seen this in the last couple of videos, that remember that this is going to use an MQI call. It's the MQ client that's installed on IIB, and it will connect into some sort of queue running on MQ. Well, how is it going to do that? Well, it does it by exposing these MQI to this MQI here into MQ, and that MQI portion comes into play here in this integration server. So it's this, right? That portion of the connection. Now, outside of the integration node, you have something here called, these are your shared libraries. And they are shared so that other pieces of IIB can use them. That is to say, other pieces. What is that? Integration nodes. Other integration nodes can use those shared libraries to do whatever it needs to do. So in other words, this integration node you can think of as an instance. So if you're familiar with, say, a DB2 instance, you can have more than one instance of DB2, right? So if this is your system, there's DB2 and there's DB2. You've got two of them potentially on one system, especially if it's a pretty high-powered system. And that's an instance, and that's an instance. Well, same idea here in IIB. You can have multiple instances running. So you could consider IIB to have instance 1 and then another instance and so on, right? And of course, that's what this is here. So when you sort of put all that together, you're quickly seeing these larger pieces and how they fit. And remember too, these are the static libraries, and inside here these are the shared libraries, of course. And then these here are your static libraries, right? So that's important. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that and we haven't seen this yet, but there are components that live out here, right in this area here. And those components, depending on what they are doing, are essentially connecting into the integration node. So you can have a component here, and you could have a component here, and you can have a component here. All of those are connecting into the IIB. And what is it that they're doing? Well, one of these, because remember we haven't drawn this anywhere yet, is the toolkit. Remember we had said that there are two parts to IIB. There's the toolkit, and then there's the runtime, right here. But the runtime doesn't have any graphical interface, and of course that's why the toolkit exists. So the toolkit will let you do that. And then it connects in. And then separately you can have, we haven't looked at this yet either, but there's actually a web interface for IIB, which is nice because you can see which applications are running, their status, and you can essentially do a bunch of administrative work through the web interface. And then you also may have an HTTP client or a Java client. These can also connect into the integration node. And then separately, you may have some sort of external system, some completely external system, like you may have a versioning control system. So you can see changes, and that would be external. This would be called an external system. And you can have other external systems out here as well. And in fact, one of those external systems, I really should not have drawn it like this. One of those external systems would be HTTP and Java clients, right? Those are external to IIB, and then they're coming in and doing some work.